My dad texted, "Since you never help, don't expect a dime when I'm gone." I just countered, "Understood." Then I pulled my $125,000 investment from his business. 3 days later, he was at my place, holding a handwritten apology. I, 29M, never expected a single text to destroy my relationship with my dad and nearly bankrupt his business. But sometimes life forces you to choose between being a doormat and standing up for yourself. The text came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing quarterly reports at my software development company. My phone buzzed, and I saw his name on the screen. My stomach already started churning before I even read it. Dad had been increasingly bitter lately, especially since Mom passed 2 years ago. He'd been taking out his grief on everyone around him, but I'd been getting the worst of it. "Since you never help and don't care about family, don't expect a dime when I'm gone. You've made your priorities clear." I stared at the message for a full minute. Never help? I'd invested $125,000 of my own money into his struggling construction business just 18 months ago. I'd worked weekends helping him with paperwork, modernizing his systems, and even pitched in on job sites when he was shorthanded. But apparently, declining to drop everything and help him move some equipment last weekend because I had a critical client presentation meant I was selfish and ungrateful. My hands were shaking as I typed back a simple response. "Understood." Then I did something that would change everything. I opened my laptop and pulled up the investment documents I'd signed with his business. According to the terms we'd agreed upon, I could withdraw my capital investment with 30 days' notice if the business relationship became untenable. I'd included that clause specifically because I knew how volatile Dad could be, though I never thought I'd actually use it. I drafted the withdrawal notice, citing the breakdown in our professional relationship. My $125,000 wasn't just sitting in his bank account collecting dust. That money was actively keeping his business afloat. It covered his equipment loans, employee payroll, and working capital for materials on current jobs. Without it, he'd have maybe 2 weeks before everything started falling apart. After I sent the formal notice, I called my lawyer to make sure everything was legally sound. He confirmed that the withdrawal clause was ironclad. Then I did something else that felt necessary but painful. I contacted the 3 clients I'd referred to Dad's business over the past year and politely informed them that due to changes in our business relationship, they might want to consider having contingency plans for their ongoing projects. The first few days after sending the notice were eerily quiet. I figured Dad was either too proud to respond or was assuming I was bluffing. He'd always treated my success in tech as somehow less legitimate than his work with his hands. Maybe he thought this was just another empty gesture from his soft, college-educated son who didn't understand real work. But by day 4, reality started hitting him. His bookkeeper called me directly, panicking about upcoming payroll and supplier payments. She'd been doing his books for 15 years and knew exactly how precarious his financial situation was. She begged me to reconsider, explaining that Dad was too stubborn to ask himself, but that the business would collapse without my investment. I felt sick hearing the desperation in her voice, but I held firm. I told her that my withdrawal notice was final and suggested she speak with Dad about seeking alternative financing. After I hung up, I sat in my office feeling like the worst person alive. But then I remembered all the times Dad had dismissed my contributions, all the casual cruelty he'd directed at me since Mom died, and all the ways he'd made me feel like nothing I did was ever enough. Day 6 brought a call from my uncle, Dad's younger brother. He'd apparently gotten an earful about my betrayal and was calling to mediate. He started by lecturing me about family loyalty and how Dad was still grieving Mom's death. But when I explained what had actually happened, including showing him screenshots of Dad's text and detailing all the ways I'd supported the business, his tone changed completely. He admitted he hadn't known about my financial investment or my ongoing contributions to the business. Dad had apparently told everyone that I was selfish and never helped with anything. The family narrative had been that successful software developer son was too good to help his blue-collar father. Learning the truth left my uncle speechless. By day 8, Dad's suppliers started calling me directly. Word had apparently gotten around that I was pulling funding, and they were nervous about extending credit for materials. 3 separate vendors asked if I'd personally guarantee payments for Dad's ongoing projects. The desperation in their voices told me everything I needed to know about how quickly the situation was deteriorating. Day 10 brought the call I'd been both expecting and dreading. Dad's voice was different than I'd heard in years. Gone was the casual dismissiveness and barely contained anger that had characterized our recent interactions. He sounded tired, defeated, and older somehow. He started by asking if we could meet to discuss the situation. He didn't apologize exactly, but he acknowledged that maybe he'd been hasty in his text message. I agreed to meet him at a neutral location, a coffee shop halfway between our houses. The man who walked into that coffee shop barely resembled the father I'd grown up with. He looked like he'd aged 5 years and 10 days. His shoulders were slumped, his usually perfect hair was disheveled, and his hands shook slightly as he sat down across from me. He began by explaining how overwhelming everything had become since Mom died. She'd handled so much of the business administration and personal relationships that he'd been drowning without her. He admitted that he'd been taking his frustration and grief out on everyone around him, but especially on me because I reminded him so much of her. Then he started listing specific ways I'd helped over the years that he'd never acknowledged. The late nights I'd spent modernizing his computer systems. The client relationships I'd helped him build through my professional network. The times I'd covered for him when grief made it impossible for him to function. He'd been keeping track all along, but had been too proud and hurt to admit it. The conversation lasted 3 hours. We talked about Mom's death and how differently we'd processed our grief. We talked about his fear of losing the business that had been his identity for 30 years. We talked about my own hurt at being constantly dismissed and undervalued despite my genuine efforts to help. But I held firm on the investment withdrawal. Trust, once broken, isn't easily repaired with a single conversation. I told him I needed to see real changes in how he treated people, starting with a genuine apology for his text and his behavior. Update 1. What happened next surprised me more than anything in this whole situation. Dad didn't just apologize. He spent the next 2 days writing what can only be described as the most thorough, heartfelt apology I'd ever received from him. It wasn't just about the text message. It was about years of taking me for granted, dismissing my contributions, and treating me like I was somehow lesser because I'd chosen a different path than his. He acknowledged specific incidents going back years. Times when he'd criticized my career choices at family gatherings. Occasions when he'd made snide comments about my education being a waste of money. Moments when he'd dismissed my business advice even when it turned out to be correct. But what really got to me was when he wrote about Mom. He explained that after she died, he'd been angry at everyone who was still alive, but especially angry at me because I'd inherited her analytical mind and her way of seeing solutions to problems. Every time I offered help or advice, it reminded him that she was gone and that I was trying to fill a role that could never be filled. The apology was handwritten on his letterhead, all 4 pages of it. His handwriting was careful and deliberate, like he'd taken time with every word. At the bottom, he'd signed it not just with his name, but with "Your father who loves you and is sorry." He showed up at my door 3 days after our coffee shop meeting, holding that letter and looking like he'd barely slept. When I opened the door, he didn't say anything at first. He just handed me the letter and waited while I read it. After I finished reading, he asked if he could come in. We sat in my living room, and he told me something I'd never heard before. He explained that Mom had been the one pushing him to be more appreciative of my help with the business. She'd constantly reminded him that I didn't owe them anything but chose to help anyway. She'd warned him that his dismissive attitude would eventually drive me away. Then he said something that broke my heart. He told me that the night before she died, Mom had made him promise to treat me better and to acknowledge my contributions to the family. He'd been so consumed with grief that he'd forgotten that promise until now. But here's where things got complicated. Even with the apology, I wasn't ready to reverse my investment withdrawal. The business relationship had become too toxic, and I needed to see sustained change before I could consider trusting him with that kind of money again. Dad seemed to understand this. Instead of pressuring me to change my mind, he asked for something else. He wanted my help transitioning the business away from dependence on my investment. He'd already started conversations with a business loan officer at the bank, but he needed help preparing financial projections and business plans. I agreed to help with the transition planning, but only as a consultant with clear boundaries. We'd meet weekly to work on business development strategies, but I wouldn't be involved in day-to-day operations or decision-making. It was a way to maintain our relationship while protecting myself from his volatile moods. Update 2. The next few weeks revealed just how much damage had been done to Dad's business relationships beyond just the financial impact of my withdrawal. His longtime foreman quit the day after I pulled my investment. Apparently, Dad had been increasingly difficult to work with since Mom's death, taking out his frustrations on his crew. The foreman had been tolerating it out of loyalty, but seeing the business become financially unstable was the final straw. Two of his biggest clients also started looking elsewhere. They'd heard through the construction industry grapevine that there were financial problems, and they couldn't afford to have their projects delayed or abandoned if the business collapsed. But something interesting started happening as Dad began implementing the changes we discussed in our consulting sessions. He started acknowledging his employees' contributions more openly. He began thanking his suppliers for their patience and loyalty. He even called some of our extended family members to apologize for his behavior at recent gatherings. The most significant change was in how he talked about Mom. Instead of his grief making him bitter and angry, he started sharing positive memories and talking about how she would have wanted him to handle things. It was like he'd finally started processing his loss in a healthy way instead of just letting it poison everything around him. 3 weeks after the handwritten apology, something unexpected happened. Dad's business started getting referrals from sources he'd never worked with before. Word was spreading that he was becoming easier to work with and more professional in his approach. The irony wasn't lost on either of us that nearly losing everything had forced him to become a better businessman. But the real test came when he landed a major contract that would require a significant upfront investment in materials and equipment. The project was exactly the kind of high-profile work that could stabilize his business long-term, but he needed working capital to take it on. He came to me with the opportunity, but he didn't ask me to reinvest. Instead, he showed me his business plan for securing a bank loan and asked for my feedback on his financial projections. He'd done his homework, presenting a comprehensive plan that demonstrated he'd learned from the mistakes that had made his business so dependent on my investment. I was impressed despite myself. The man sitting across from me was the competent businessman I'd always known he could be, finally applying that competence to his own situation instead of just relying on family money to cover his shortcomings. That's when I made a decision that surprised both of us. I offered to provide a reference letter to his bank, detailing my previous investment and the legitimate business reasons for my withdrawal. I also offered to serve as a reference for his character and business competence, emphasizing the positive changes I'd witnessed. The bank approved his loan application within a week. Having an established local businessman vouch for him had apparently carried significant weight with the loan officer. Dad called me the day he got approval, and for the first time in years, he sounded genuinely happy rather than just relieved or angry. Update 3. 6 months later, our relationship had transformed into something I'd never thought possible. Dad's business was thriving with his new contract. He'd hired back his foreman with a raise and added 2 new crew members. More importantly, he'd maintained the changes in how he treated people. His employees actually seemed to enjoy working for him now, and his clients were satisfied with both the quality of work and the professionalism of his approach. We established a new routine of having dinner together every Sunday, not because we felt obligated, but because we actually enjoyed each other's company. Our conversations covered everything from business strategy to memories of Mom to his concerns about retirement planning. The most significant change was that he started asking for my advice instead of dismissing it. When he was considering expanding into commercial renovation work, he brought me his research and asked for my perspective on market analysis and financial projections. When he was having personality conflicts with a difficult client, he asked how I handled similar situations in my business. But what really showed me how much had changed was what happened when I was going through my own crisis. My biggest client unexpectedly terminated their contract due to budget cuts, representing about 40% of my annual revenue. I was stressed about making payroll for my employees and maintaining my business operations while I searched for replacement contracts. I hadn't planned to tell Dad about the situation because I didn't want him to worry or feel like he needed to help. But he noticed my stress during one of our Sunday dinners and kept asking until I explained what was happening. His response floored me. He immediately offered to hire my company for all of his IT and business systems consulting needs. He also connected me with 3 other business owners who needed software development work. Within 2 weeks, I'd replaced most of my lost revenue through his referrals. But more than the practical help, what meant the most was how he approached it. He didn't lecture me about business management or suggest that my problems were due to poor planning. He just asked what I needed and did everything in his power to help me get it. That's when I knew our relationship had fundamentally changed. We'd moved from a dynamic where I felt obligated to help him and he felt entitled to my help, to a genuine partnership where we both chose to support each other. Looking back on that text message and my decision to pull my investment, I realized it was the best thing that could have happened to both of us. Dad had needed to face the consequences of his behavior and learn to value the people who cared about him. I had needed to establish boundaries and prove to myself that I wouldn't accept being treated poorly just because we were family. The crisis had forced us both to grow in ways that probably wouldn't have happened otherwise. Dad learned to manage his grief constructively and treat people with respect. I learned that setting boundaries doesn't mean abandoning family. It means creating space for healthier relationships. We never did restore my original investment in his business. By the time our relationship had healed enough for me to consider it, he no longer needed it. His business was financially stable, and he developed the management skills to keep it that way. Instead, we started a new tradition. Every year on Mom's birthday, we volunteer together at the local Habitat for Humanity build. It's our way of honoring her memory while using our respective skills to help others. Dad supervises the construction work, and I handle project management and logistics coordination. Sometimes the worst fights lead to the best relationships, but only when both people are willing to do the hard work of actually changing instead of just apologizing and expecting everything to go back to the way it was.